Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Alexandre Gajevic Sayegh, a postdoctoral fellow at the Macmillan Center and a lecturer in the Department of Political Science at Yale University. Professor Gajevic Sayegh is particularly interested in climate justice and its relation to climate policy, as well as in the ethics of carbon pricing. Today, we'll talk with Professor Gajevic Sayegh about his research on climate justice after the Paris Agreement. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with an overview of the paper that you have forthcoming in the Journal of Global Ethics. Tell us about it.
Sure. This paper presents a novel way to respond to the question of how the burdens to mitigate climate change, so to reduce our carbon emissions, should be divided between countries. Think of the question, should developing countries be allowed to pollute? The way this question is framed suggests that for us to give developing countries less responsibilities is to allow them to pollute more. My paper wants for us to resist the temptation of answering the question in this way, and I argue that the principles of climate justice we have should not be applied to emissions reductions, but should be applied to climate finance, which I'll explain in a moment. Okay. Essentially, what this paper tries to accomplish is to find a way, a strategy for us to develop in a clean way, allowing developing countries to develop in a clean way and still reduce our carbon emissions. So I try to provide the principles of justice that should regulate climate finance, and I try to apply this to the Green Climate Fund.
And why write the paper? What inspired you to write the paper?
Well, two things. First, that I believe facts have changed on the ground. Developing countries are now polluting much more than they used to. Developing countries are today responsible for 63% of global emissions, where they only were responsible to 41% back in 2004, just to give a comparison. So the way for us to include these countries in a meaningful way to reduce their carbon emissions and be fair sounded like an interesting question for someone working on climate justice. And secondly, while I was writing the paper, I realized that developing countries were still urging rich countries to fulfill their pledges of climate finance, which are essentially today to have $100 billion available annually since from 2020 for developing countries to mitigate and to adapt to climate change.
Okay, now did these developing countries participate in the Paris Agreement? Did they sign off on that?
They absolutely, all of them did.
All of them did. So with that said, how are they moving? What are some of the developing countries who are the larger producers of emissions?
So some of them are what we call the basic countries. So Brazil, South Africa, India, China. They are among the biggest polluters today. Indonesia too is among these countries who have large populations and pollute a lot. So. The thing is that they have somewhat decreased, they have fought poverty and at the same time have increased their emissions. So if this should be a model to all countries to try to fight poverty, we would have a problem.
Right, right. So how did you do the research for the paper? What was your methodology?
Well, essentially I did one of the things I enjoy the most, which are trying to model principles of justice in the real world. So there was a little bit of a challenge here. It was just not to formulate principles of climate justice, but to see how they can be applied in the real world. And also, I found that the leading principle we had since the Rio Summit in 1992, which is the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, was a little bit imprecise. I think we needed to define more clearly what we mean by this principle, which is why I suggested that we break down this notion and say that we have common responsibilities to mitigate, but differentiated responsibilities to finance. So we all have to reduce our carbon emissions, but we're not all paid the same.
Right, and let's go into detail with that. Talk a little bit more about that and give us some specifics.
So I think that the traditional way that we approach this question to say that, to have differentiated responsibilities to reduce carbon emissions is a strategy that is no longer available today. So it seemed to me that for us to include all countries and still do that in a way that is fair, we needed a new mechanism. And the notion of climate finance have tried to respond to this. And my paper aims to find a more structured way and a more just way to do that.
Okay, and what would be a more just way to do that?
So I think it's important that we try to model these principles of climate justice, really take into account the developments in climate governance, so what happened after Paris, and really take into account the real state of carbon emissions today. For me, a just way to do that would be to use our best principles of climate justice. The best principles of climate justice, in my opinion, are the principles of capacity and the principle of historical responsibility. These two principles mean capacity, that we don't all have the same capacity to fight climate change. The principle says that capacity should be assigned, the responsibility should be assigned according to agents' capacity to respond to the problem. So we don't all have the same capacity to fight climate change, and developed countries have the capacity to help developing countries do that. And the principle of historical responsibility says that responsibility should be assigned according to agents' historical connection to the problem. Hence, the idea that we have not all polluted the same. We have polluted much more than a lot of developing countries. Therefore, we have a duty to assist them to transition to a low-carbon economy. Essentially, I think there's an important notion in historical responsibility that says that we have denied them the opportunity to develop in a way that they can afford. Okay. And this is, I think, what motivates and what is behind the idea of climate finance. This should regulate the idea of climate finance.
Okay, how have we denied them the opportunity to develop?
Well, we have emitted so much in the past that today, for us to stay under 2 degrees Celsius, which is paramount that we do, there is no room for them to develop in a way that, in the same way that we did. So we already at over 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. If we reached 450, that would give us a very small chance of staying under 2 degrees Celsius. And the way we are, we are increasing the concentration of about 3 parts per million per year. That gives us very little room, and that means that is impossible for all developing countries to develop in the same way that we did. So now we all have to reduce our emissions.
Right, which is tough. So what is the Green Climate Fund, and how does that relate to your work?
Well, so the Green Climate Fund is a new fund that was created to help developing countries mitigate, so reduce their emissions and adapt to climate change. And the Green Climate Fund is counting a little bit on the pledges of developed countries to give $100 billion annually. So the Green Climate Fund will be responsible to manage and distribute part of these funds. And it relates to my research in various ways. I think 2 important ways is that the Green Climate Fund is a signal, and climate finance is a signal. They both are signals to tell developing countries they have a way to develop, they have the means to develop in a low-carbon way. So
and that's solar, wind, those kinds of energies.
Well, absolutely. Also, it also connects to adaptation too, but it has to do with renewable energies such as wind and solar power, which are very, very important.
Okay, and who is overseeing how these developing countries are developing and hopefully adapting to the Paris Agreement?
So that's another important way of how the Green Climate Fund connects to my research. I think the fund is right this moment at a time that requires a more structured way to replenish its resources. So we need a more structured and just way to say how we're going to raise this 100 billion per year. So that's why I think that my 2 principles of justice come in and say this actually gives us a lot of insight on how to raise this money. And the Green Climate Fund today is supposed to build trust. So it is time for us to give the Green Climate Fund the means to fulfill its mission. And we have the means to do that.
So do you foresee the United States actually participating and giving the appropriate amount of money to the Green Fund?
Well, we're very far off the mark, I think, especially with the recent changes in Washington. But I think there is a way, especially if we think of climate policies like carbon pricing, there are ways for us to raise this money and contribute to the just amount. The United States have to participate, especially given the two reasons that we said. We're the world's greatest economy, and also we're the ones that are more responsible for
a lot of the pollution.
For the historical pollution. So these two reasons say that the United States should be actually the front runner in contributing to climate finance.
Right. Unfortunately, however, given the current political situation, I doubt that that's going to happen. So given that, do you think that we are significantly in danger of not meeting that 2% cap on temperature?
Well, so we are dangerously right now on the path of not meeting the 2 degrees Celsius of temperature increase. The way things are going right now tell us that there are chances of us not meeting this goal. I think it's important that the Paris Agreement give us a strategy for us to increase and to ratchet up our objectives every 5 years. So we have to understand that we are going to scale up our targets. And so right now we're not on the way to meet this target, but scaling up our objectives maybe is going to put us on a path. We're just not right now, and I think we need the United States to be on this path right now, but perhaps with recent elections, maybe in 4 years we're going to be in a better, in 3 years we're going to be in a better position than we are right now.
Knock on wood, hopefully that is the case. So is the Green Fund working directly with developing countries and giving them funding and kind of sharing some ideas with them as how to, best practices for energy conservation?
Oh, yes. So, well, there's a lot of research put in the Green Climate Fund. So, yes, they're doing a very good job right now. I think the projects that have received funds, a lot of them are going to allow developing countries to develop in a green way and also to adapt to climate change. So this has the potential, but we really need make sure that what they're doing is transparent and that we're going to have a good oversight and also that they're going to have the means. So I think it's an institution that could play a large role today in the fight against climate change.
Okay, you also mentioned carbon pricing, and I know that's another project you're working on too. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're working on in terms of that?
Well, this is another paper that is coming on right now. And so just to mention on the effort in the United States to fight climate change, there was a conservative plan to fight climate change that was published early on this year, and by really prominent conservative thinkers in the country. And this plan put forward the idea of putting a price on carbon. So there could be a bipartisan effort there to put a price on carbon.
That would be wonderful.
Which I think is something that a lot of people agree on. In my opinion, I think it's where I diverge perhaps with some of the conservatives, is that I think this is just one measure for us to fight climate change. It's not the only measure. It's perhaps the main one, but it's not the only one. So we need to put a price on carbon right now. We also need other things, but I think what is fascinating with putting a price on carbon is that is a way that allows us to connect those that cause the harm with those being harmed. So we put a price on carbon, we generate funds, and we could use these funds to compensate people that are being harmed today by climate change and are going to be harmed in the future by climate change. So I think if we connect these two ideas, well, carbon pricing should be used as a tool for climate justice. The Congressional Budget Office just put forward a figure that in 2011 for 2012 that with a carbon price of $20 per ton of carbon, which is low. It's low. I think even the conservatives agree that we could have a higher price than that. But even with a low price on carbon of $20 per ton of CO2, that would give us on average 115 billion per year. And in my calculations, the United States would have to pay to be fair, so the way I model the two principles of justice, of capacity and of historical responsibility, so I gave equal weight for each one of these principles. So 50 billion for the principle of capacity and 50 billion for the principle of historical responsibility. So I took the emissions from each country starting in 1990. I calculated that the United States will have to pay around 8 billion when it comes to the principle of historical responsibility, and I calculate the principle of capacity using both GDP per capita and total GDP, and I came up with a figure that from the 50 billion, the United States would be responsible for $21 billion. The biggest economy, the world's big economies will have to pay a substantial amount there. So I came up with a figure that the just amount the United States will have to pay to climate justice would be around $29 to $30 billion per year. And with a carbon, just a single price on carbon of $20 per ton of carbon would be more than sufficient, would be actually 3 times over the amount that the United States would have to pay for climate justice.
How do you determine, again, the cost of the carbon emission, and historically, how does someone track that?
Oh, the measurements. Oh, we have improved a lot in the measurements, but that is climate science, and I do climate ethics and climate policy, so I wouldn't venture too much. But I know that we have
ways to do it.
We have monitored the emissions from countries since 1850. So we have a good notion of historical emissions. For all countries since around like 1850. I think most people use 1990 as the starting date to calculate historical emissions, but we have a good precise notion of how much countries have emitted there.
Because I would say if you went back to the industrial age in this country, I'm sure with coal being used, it would be quite huge.
The more we go back, the more we're gonna put strong requirements on developed countries. So if you go before 1990, I think we're going to see that the responsibilities of developed countries are more than if we start counting in 1990. But since the principle I'm using of historical responsibility is connected to the notion of harm, that's a strong notion. And we normally would have to give countries at least the notion that they know that they are harming. And it's easier to tell countries that we know that you knew that you were harming after 1990.
Right, true. Thank you so much for being here today. Your work is very important.
Thank you very much.
Okay. For more information about Professor Gajevic Sayegh and his work, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.